Today I'm going to be watching about the ongoing situation between Canada and the USA, these tariffs and just that volatility in the relationship caused by Trump and the USA. And this one I thought would be interesting because it's not really something I know too much about, but I thought this would be a good opportunity to learn and see what's going on. It says, can the US auto industry survive without Canada? So I think the US auto industry is something that I've heard Trump talk about a lot before. About how he wants cars made in America. But interested to know Canada's impact on that, what Canada does in that process for the US auto industry or for the production, manufacture of cars in the USA. So interested to see this, to learn about it. If you have any knowledge of it, tell me more about it. If you know what Canada does for the USA in that respect, please let me know. Guess we'll find out some in this video and see what's going to happen moving forward.
Donald Trump says he wants every car sold in the US to be made in the US, and he's willing to disrupt an entire industry to make that happen.
If we don't make a deal with Canada, we're going to put a big tariff on cars, could be a 50 or 100%, because we don't want their cars.
So that got us wondering, just how intertwined are these two countries when it comes to making cars? And can the US auto industry survive without Canada? Let's go through it.
Does Canada have a car? Does it produce its own car? If not, why not? Is there any anything blocking that, anything that stops that from happening? I feel like that would be a good industry for Canada to create its own and just add to that ongoing thing about being a bit more self-sufficient and invigorating the Canadian economy as well. I remember watching a video about Rick Mercer looking at a Canadian electric car from a long time ago. I don't think it took off, but interested to know more about the domestic car industry in Canada and how it could improve.
The most straightforward way we can try to answer this question is to first try and understand how much the US auto industry leans on Canada today. One way to do this is by simply following the production cycle of a single car part. Let's take, as an example, the pistons that go in a car's engine. How do you make a piston? Well, you might use raw aluminum, almost always sourced from Quebec, because that's where about 80% of North America's aluminum comes from. Say that aluminum is then shipped to a factory in St. Catharines, Ontario, where it's melted down into the right shape. Then those pistons are shipped to Detroit to be finished, so they meet the exact standards of the vehicle they're going into. That's already a fair bit of travel for just one small car part, but the pistons journey doesn't stop there, because now they need to actually put these pistons into an engine. This happens in Windsor, Ontario, so back over the border. And then another team in Michigan puts the engine in the car and then finishes assembly. Yet another trip across the border.
So that I had no idea about that. I mean, just the fact about how much aluminium is produced in Canada, in Quebec, that's quite mind-blowing as well. I guess that has further ramifications, not just for cars, but for a whole host of different products as well. Could Canada do anything with that, put tariffs on aluminium to the USA and try and fight back in that way? I guess maybe you don't want to escalate the situation, but I'm not too sure if that's something that would be possible. But yeah, it's interesting. I never really knew it goes back and forth so much just to build a car in America, to do these different things. It just really shows you how interlinked these two countries are. And when you hear Trump talk about it, it's just very just basic and not thinking about all these different steps. It's just the end thing. We just want to build the car, but not really taking into consideration the parts of it and everything that goes into that process.
So the piston went back and forth across the border 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 times, not as a piston. First it started out as the material, and then it was the first stage of processing, the next stage of processing. Eventually it winds up in somebody's car.
And that's just the journey of one part in one engine. Multiply that by almost every single part, and you've got a car handled by hundreds of Canadian and American workers back and forth across the border. Now, maybe this sounds complicated, and it is.
The choreography of making a car and running literally hundreds of supplier partner dance partners is intricate, They go on these milk runs and they pick them up at 12 different suppliers, and they're bringing parts into distribution warehouses in close proximity, and then they're making these parts pallets, and then they're bringing them into the plant, and they're just showing up right at the moment that they need them.
So the next question becomes, why exactly do car companies make this complicated process even more complicated by jumping back and forth over the border so many times? According to everyone we spoke to, the most relevant reason right now US automakers do things this way is because Canadian and American suppliers and manufacturers specialize in different things. And when you have free trade, it's actually cheaper and more efficient for a car company to go where the specialist is, and the border just doesn't really matter. Like, it's just an arbitrary line, and it takes less than 15 minutes to get from Windsor to Detroit, where you'll find lots of these plants.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Is like, even though it's like two different countries, it's closer than sending it like across to the other side of the country or doing these sort of things. It's basically within the same area, so it's like so easy to actually do. And yeah, Canada having that expertise is very important as well, as a sort of bargaining chip, I guess, if things were to escalate more.
There is very little duplication between Canada and the United States. Things that are done here for a reason. It's faster, cheaper, more reliable, higher quality.
At the end of the day, these companies have to make money, and they decided that, well, getting this part in Chatham, Ontario is cheaper than getting this part in Livonia, Michigan, and they can do it, they can deliver it, they can get it done on time.
Which all makes sense, but let's keep going with the why questions. Why did the industry decide to do it this way in the first place? Has Canada's auto expertise really always been so singular and without equal in a way that the US just can't replicate?
We have these companies in Canada because that's how the industry has evolved since the 1960s. So there's historical reasons for it.
A long, long time ago, GM and Ford did operate plants in Canada, but those plants were only making cars for Canadians and sometimes the British Commonwealth.
This car was for Their Majesties King George and Queen Elizabeth.
Their US plants made cars for Americans. But then in the 1950s, Canada ran into a problem. Automatic cars became a thing, and almost everybody wanted one. But the Canadian plants didn't have the technology to make this new type of car. So the fear became Canada would have to start importing most of its cars from the US, and its domestic auto industry would collapse.
The Canadian government kind of freaks out and they say, hey, we've got this technological problem and it threatens to wipe out our whole industry. So the Canadian government enacts a number of tariff measures that are designed to encourage the production of cars in Canada.
Yeah, you caught that, right? That word that we've heard before.
The tariffs, we're going to tariff the hell out of them.
I am a tariff man.
Yes, that one. Except 70 years ago, it's Canada essentially kicking off a trade war with the US by putting tariffs on American cars. And the thinking then should feel pretty familiar too. It was all about making foreign cars more expensive to convince car makers and the US government to find a new way of running the industry.
A lot of people on both sides of the border get very agitated about this, but they also see it as an opportunity. And the way that they figure it out and what they eventually come to is the 1965 Auto Pact.
That deal was essentially, we'll allow US automakers to ship cars and parts back and forth between Canada and the US, tariff-free, but there are conditions, including that those automakers must invest more in their Canadian plants so they don't disappear.
The idea was, if you sell a car in Canada, you have to build one in Canada to, keep things even. And so the car companies started to invest more and more in Canada and build more factories and have larger production runs.
By 1973, with the Auto Pact in full bloom, Canada builds 1.6 million vehicles and over 1 million of them go to the United States.
So look, we're kind of streamlining history here, but this is effectively how this convoluted cross-border production chain got started. And what you have now is a system that's in pretty deep. So when you ask GM or Ford why they can't just build all their cars and all their parts in the US, like Trump wants them to.
And one of the reasons that General Motors and Ford respond and say we build cars in Canada is because we've been building cars in Canada since 1904 and 1918, and we want to be good corporate citizens. We've also spent an awful lot of money investing in the plants here. We've got a lot of employees here.
And there are, of course, other reasons too. A lower Canadian dollar, for example, means things that are built in Canada are cheaper for those American companies.
If you want to sell something to Americans, having a low exchange rate is a really good thing. Certain commodities are cheaper in Canada because they're made here. If the US wanted to make aluminum, okay, they could, but they would have to build, probably, I've seen estimates, 6 or 8 nuclear power plants to replace the electricity that Quebec has all day, every day.
But even all of this still avoids the original question, which is, okay, there's a system, fine, but could the American auto industry survive without Canada if the US tried today to engineer it that way? And the answer to that is yes, but getting there would be painful.
Once you start to unravel those really complicated cross-border supply chains, you're running the risk of actually grinding the industry to a halt.
First, just consider how many new plants US automakers would have to build to replace their Canadian operations and how expensive that would be.
If you want to build 1.4 million vehicles in the US that are currently built in Canada, that is 5, maybe 6 assembly plants. Assembly plants are $3, maybe $4 billion, 3, maybe 4 years to build.
Take these Stellantis assembly plants in Windsor and Brampton, Ontario, for example. Less than 3 years ago, the company agreed to invest $3.6 billion into these operations.
We are committed to Canada for the long run and for the next 100 years.
If they wanted to uproot that plant and move it to the United States, they could do it, but it would be really disruptive and it would be very costly.
And you'd have to staff these new American plants too, right? Which, we should note, is exactly what the president wants, to bring jobs back to America.
If you build here, you have no tariffs whatsoever. And I think that's what's going to happen. I think our country is going to be flooded with jobs for everybody.
But you'd have to find hundreds, possibly thousands of people that can match what the Canadians are doing. And the US is already struggling with not just a skills gap, but a gap in applicants for open positions in manufacturing.
They don't have a large pool of skilled workers to do this work. If they put a huge tariff on tools, dies, and molds from Canada, there really is no alternative. The US has never made a lot of inroads into that business because the expertise resides here. And that's not easy to duplicate quickly.
So everyone we spoke to agreed this could be done, but it would take years, if not decades, to get the supply chain back on track. And in the meantime, the price of American cars in the US would likely shoot up. At which point, you also have to ask, is Canada still buying those cars?
We buy about 1.8 million vehicles a year. They might lose a market, or their market of 1.8 million vehicles drops because maybe we put tariffs on US-made vehicles, and maybe we take those tariffs off Chinese-made vehicles. And it needs that.
Bottom line, trade wars are messy. And to completely remove Canada from the equation, Donald Trump would have to stomach a lot of chaos, a very unhappy neighbor, and many unhappy automakers. But here's the thing, Trump may not need any of it to happen because the threat of it happening could be enough to force American automakers to reconsider their operations in Canada and put any new money into the US instead.
Yeah, very interesting again. Like, it's like pretty cool to learn about this again with these tariffs. It's like a terrible situation, but for me, like, it's really making me learn about other parts of Canada that I know very little about, like the economy. So it's cool to learn about that. I never really knew of Canada's importance in that process. It makes sense being so close, especially somewhere like Michigan, where a lot of cars were produced and things. Like, obviously that's a long-standing relationship that benefited both countries and needed both countries as well in that process for selling American cars. So yeah, interested to see. Do you think Trump is just doing this as a threat to just try and change things by threats? He doesn't really have the like you say, balls to follow through. I don't know, is that the case? But what do you think? I think the guy at the end there talked about putting tariffs on America but taking them off China. Do you think that's a good strategy? Is there any way of Canada just making its own cars and keeping everything like in-house as it was, or so to speak, and selling their own cars in Canada? Would that ever happen? Has it ever happened? Tell me what you think about this one. Thanks.